If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. Welcome to the Tennessee History Nerd. This is a podcast dedicated to Tennessee's past. Every week we bring you a new story about the people, places, and events that have shaped Tennessee and made it, and us, who and what we are. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place, and sit back and enjoy. One of the things that really stands out when you begin looking into the military leadership of the armies on both sides of the Civil War is just how many of them had served in the war with Mexico in 1846 to 1848. And to some extent, that's illustrated in one of the early but influential series of battles in the West in the Civil War, the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson Campaign. Additionally, it's no secret that the Civil War was a portrait of contradictions and ironies, and that's definitely true during the Fort Henry-Fort Donelson Campaign. And the Civil War, especially for the Confederacy, is a story of missteps and missed opportunities. And that's highlighted in this campaign as well, to be sure. But I think that perhaps one of the most profoundly moving stories of the war, and I don't think that tragedy is too strong a word, is how often men who were family members or affectionate friends found themselves on opposite sides of the war. And once again, that's true in the Fort Henry-Fort Donelson campaign as well. And in fact, it may be one of the most defining stories of the Battle of Fort Donelson in particular, which is why today's episode is entitled A Surrender Between Friends. But before there was a surrender, there were the battles of the campaign, and there were the events that led to the battles, and there were all those things that play a part in the overarching story that unfolds in this compelling account. And indeed, it's possible to take things to extremes and say that the seeds of this event were being sown in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, or even in the compromises that were necessary during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. But the more immediate foundational events that precipitated the campaign were being laid during the period of time that the Confederate States were struggling to organize as quickly as possible following the cascade of secessions following the presidential election of 1860. Shortly after the war began, as the Confederate Army was being organized, Confederate President Jefferson Davis appointed his old friend Albert Sidney Johnston, whom he considered to be one of the finest commanders in the South, to command the Confederate forces in the West. Johnston had a daunting task. First, the frontier of the Confederacy was quite fluid in those early months. Tennessee was the last of the southern states to secede, which it formally did in June 1861. It became clear that Kentucky wasn't going to secede by September of 1861, about the time that Johnston was appointed. So Johnston's task became to figure out how to defend the West, essentially the entire northern border of Tennessee, with the troops and armament he had available to him. He inherited the work being done to construct Forts Henry and Donelson, which had begun in mid-1861. In fact, if the information I have is correct, Fort Donelson was begun in mid-May 1861, which is even before Tennessee had voted to leave the Union in the June referendum on secession. Fort Donelson's position on the Cumberland River wasn't a bad one, but Fort Henry was being constructed in the floodplain on the Tennessee River. The selection of its site has been questioned ever since because its location was no small factor in its fall. But it's also relevant to note that it was already selected and under construction by the time that Albert Sidney Johnston took command of the Western Department in 1861. The Tennessee state officials and engineers who selected the site of Fort Henry didn't have the option to build on the high ground on the opposite side of the river because the other side of the river was in Kentucky. They built it where they actually had the option to build, poor though the site was. After Johnston assumed command and after the Confederacy had made the decision to move preemptively into Kentucky, then Johnston's subordinate, Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman, made the decision to begin fortifying the bluffs across the river from Fort Henry, what would become known as Fort Hyman. One of the paradoxes of a military forced to defend with a small force is that trying to defend everywhere ultimately defends nowhere. Its forces are stretched too thin to protect anywhere adequately. And that was the situation in which Johnston found himself in 1861. And his conundrum is also demonstrated by the fact that during the time he was trying to figure out how best to defend the potential broad front of Tennessee, the Union Army was trying to figure out how best to invade the Confederacy in the West. In fact, the initial plan was to invade into East Tennessee and take Knoxville, where the population was the most Union sympathetic. What tipped the scales in their choosing first to push southward up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers was that the river and rail networks in Middle and West Tennessee were more extensive and better developed, which would make better logistical support networks for the Union Army. And thus, in February 1862, before Fort Hyman could be completed, and with Fort Henry in a difficult place to defend, at the urging of President Lincoln, Union operations began in the Fort Henry-Fort Donelson Campaign. It's of interest that the Union Navy began operating in a way that it had never operated before at this point. It began what we would today call brown water operations, riverine operations as opposed to blue water operations in ocean and coastal waters. But the term brown water navy was actually coined during the Civil War to describe those vessels that operated on the rivers, like the muddy Mississippi, and then the term was revived a century later in Vietnam. But in August of 1861, work began on the construction of a fleet of gunboats designed to operate on the navigable rivers of the Western Confederacy. Because these vessels were named for cities, they were called the city-class gunboats, and they played a significant role in the Union prosecution of the war throughout the Western theater. But because they were ready in early 1862, they made their grand debut in the Fort Henry-Fort Donelson Campaign. And not only would they show up there, they would play a crucial role in the campaign's prosecution. The man who was selected to command the Union Army in this campaign was Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant. And though his name would one day become synonymous with Union victory, in 1862, he was still a relatively obscure Union officer, and there even have been questions as to whether he was the right man for the job. His career had shown flashes of brilliance during the Mexican War, but it had also been marked by resignation from the Army and several unsuccessful attempts to make a living in civilian life. President Lincoln, however, had become increasingly frustrated with generals who seemed reluctant to move. Grant didn't have any such hesitation. He wasn't reckless, but he believed that wars were won by taking the initiative rather than waiting for perfect conditions. Working alongside Grant was Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote of the United States Navy. Foote and Grant made an effective team almost immediately. While the Army and Navy had cooperated before, rarely had they attempted to conduct an inland campaign on the scale that was now being planned. The rivers of the Western Confederacy were about to become highways for invasion. Those city-class gunboats would carry the fight to the Confederate forts, while transports would carry thousands of soldiers to support the naval operations. It was an entirely different way of waging war than Americans had ever seen before, and it was possible at a scale never before seen because of the advent of steam-powered boats. The first objective of this combined Union military and naval force was Fort Henry. As of February 1862, it was completed only in part and already plagued by its unfortunate location because Fort Henry stood on low ground beside the Tennessee River. To put this in perspective, you can't even visit the site today because when Kentucky Lake was created in the 1940s, the land Fort Henry was on was completely covered by the impounded lake. It wasn't even high enough to avoid that. And in 1862, before the first shots were even fired, rising water had begun to invade portions of the fort. The Confederates on the scene fully understood the problem. Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman recognized that if the fort were to withstand a determined attack, it would need the help from the unfinished works on the Kentucky bluffs at Fort Hyman. But Fort Hyman was little more than an earthwork under construction. There were no heavy guns mounted there capable of stopping the Union advance. Recognizing that he couldn't adequately defend both positions with the men available to him, Tillman made a difficult decision. He sent most of his command across the river to strengthen Fort Hyman and retained only enough soldiers at Fort Henry to man the guns. His hope wasn't necessarily to win a great victory, but to delay the Union advance long enough for the remainder of his command to escape and continue the fight elsewhere. In many respects, that decision illustrates the difficult position in which Confederate commanders throughout the West consistently found themselves. They rarely had enough men to do everything they needed to do or wished to do. So every decision was the result of the difficult calculus of determining what they could afford to lose, just as the site itself had been chosen based on what was possible at the time, not what was preferred. If your idea of a good weekend includes a fishing rod, a boat, a campsite, and a Tennessee sunset over the water, then you need to check out Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. Located on scenic Kentucky Lake on the beautiful Tennessee River, just 9 miles off Interstate 40 at exit 133, Birdsong is conveniently located halfway between Memphis and Nashville. Family owned and welcoming guests since 1961, Birdsong is now operated by the second generation of the Keast family, and whether you're looking for cabins, full-service RV sites, primitive tent camping, boat rentals, boat sales, fuel, bait, or easy lake access, Birdsong has you covered. Be sure to visit the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, where you'll find Tennessee's official state gem, the freshwater pearl, and learn how the freshwater pearl industry brought worldwide attention to this part of Tennessee. To start planning your getaway, visit birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. That's birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. I think you'll be glad you went. And when you call, tell them Big John sent you. Then, on February 6, 1862, Foote's ironclads moved against Fort Henry, and what followed surprised almost everyone. The gunboats advanced steadily toward the fort, exchanging heavy fire with the Confederate batteries. Although the Confederates fought stubbornly, the low position of the fort proved disastrous. Floodwaters had already submerged portions of the works, which forced several guns out of action before the battle even began. With every passing minute, the Federal gunboats drew closer, and their concentrated fire gradually overwhelmed the remaining batteries. Grant's infantry was still making its way through the muddy roads toward the fort when Tillman realized the situation had become hopeless. Rather than sacrifice the remainder of his small command, he ordered most of his soldiers to continue their withdrawal while he remained behind with a handful of artillerymen to defend the fort until resistance was no longer possible. Shortly afterward, Tillman surrendered Fort Henry to Flag Officer Foote. That surrender accomplished two things for the Federal forces. First, it opened the Tennessee River to Union gunboats and transports. Almost immediately, Federal vessels were able to begin steaming deep into the Confederate interior, demonstrating just how vulnerable the Western River system had become. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly in the immediate sense, it placed Fort Donelson in imminent danger. The defensive system Albert Sidney Johnston had been trying to build was not yet robust enough to lose a fort without seriously damaging the overall defensive line. And although Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were built to guard different rivers, their proximity to one another meant that events at one inevitably affected the other. Once Fort Henry fell and the Tennessee River was open, Grant could use that success as the springboard for an overland march of only about 12 miles to Fort Donelson across the land between the rivers. So while the two forts weren't mutually supporting fortifications, they were inseparably linked in the larger campaign. To provide some brief modern context here, thanks to the TVA impounding the Tennessee River here as Kentucky Lake and the Cumberland River as Lake Barkley, this strip of land is now known as LBL, or Land Between the Lakes. The fall of Fort Henry didn't end the campaign, it simply shifted its focus. Fort Henry had opened the Tennessee River, but Fort Donelson still guarded the Cumberland. Until both rivers had been secured for the Union, securing the objectives of opening both rivers to the Union remained incomplete. And Grant understood that time was now his enemy. Every day that passed gave the Confederates more opportunity to strengthen Fort Donelson, to reinforce its garrison, and to recover from the shock of losing Fort Henry. So Grant wanted to move almost immediately. In fact, as early as February 7th, only one day after the surrender of Fort Henry, he informed General Henry Halleck that he intended to cross over to the Cumberland River and take and destroy Fort Donelson. It was an ambitious timetable, but Grant believed that momentum was on his side. Unfortunately for Grant, enthusiasm alone could not overcome geography. Heavy rains had swollen the Tennessee River and flooded the low ground around Fort Henry. The same rains that had contributed to Fort Henry's fall now worked against the Union Army. Roads leading toward Fort Donelson became nearly impassable in places, especially during the first few miles east of Fort Henry, where deep ravines and low-lying ground remained saturated from flooding. Moving thousands of soldiers was difficult enough. Moving artillery and supply wagons through that terrain proved even more challenging. Grant decided to adapt to the circumstances. Rather than waiting until every wagon and every cannon could move comfortably, he considered advancing with infantry and cavalry first, leaving much of his transportation behind if necessary. But then a reconnaissance convinced him that Fort Donelson was considerably stronger than Fort Henry was and would require artillery support. This was one of the first indications that this next battle would not unfold like the last one. The delay also affected Flag Officer Andrew Foote. His victory at Fort Henry hadn't come without cost. The Confederate artillery, though not enough to save the fort, hadn't been completely ineffective against the Union gunboats. Several of them needed repairs, and other vessels were scattered on different assignments. Foote therefore returned down the Tennessee River to the Ohio and then began the somewhat confusing journey back up the Cumberland River toward Fort Donelson. River travel has a peculiar way of ignoring the directions on a map. Foote was actually traveling north while moving downstream, only to turn around and head generally south while moving upstream. If that sounds confusing, don't feel bad. I actually got myself turned around on that very point when I filmed here back in February of 2026 and had to correct that video when I came back in June after I realized I'd been thinking in terms of a road map instead of a river. Anyway, while Grant and Foote worked diligently to resume the offensive, Albert Sidney Johnston was himself using every hour he could gain. In other words, both armies spent those 6 days doing exactly the very same thing. They were racing. Grant raced to attack before the Confederates could recover. Johnston raced to strengthen Fort Donelson before Grant could arrive. Foote raced to reassemble his flotilla. Halleck raced reinforcements toward the front. The weather slowed everyone equally, but it didn't stop anyone. And this brings up a point that also needs to be mentioned. It's sometimes convenient to blame the weather for failures, but typically the troops on both sides are dealing with the same weather. I'm not saying it's not a factor, but if it's hot for both sides. And if it's raining for both sides. One side being flooded while the other is in boats makes a difference, of course, but infantry troops on both sides of the same battlefield generally suffer equally. By February 11th, Grant had gathered enough men, enough artillery, and enough supplies to move. His army crossed the rugged strip of country between the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, following two narrow roads toward Fort Donelson. The difficult terrain slowed the march, but by the afternoon of February 12th, the leading elements of the Union Army began arriving outside Confederate defenses. The second act of the campaign was about to begin. The loss of Fort Henry had forced Johnston to make several difficult decisions very quickly. Now, before we go any further, I think it's only fair to General Johnston to make one observation. Some of the decisions he's about to make are going to look questionable in retrospect. That's because we're looking backward with the benefit of more than 160 years of hindsight. Johnston didn't have that luxury. In several cases, he was forced to choose not between a good option and a bad one, but from among several bad options, hoping he was choosing the least bad from among them. One of these decisions involved the command of Fort Donelson. When Fort Henry fell on February 6th, Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman became a prisoner of war, and Johnston lost the services of one of his most trusted subordinates. Command at Fort Donelson briefly fell to Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson, who had already been assigned there. Johnson himself was one of the great ironies of the Civil War. Born in Ohio and raised in an abolitionist Quaker family, he'd reportedly assisted the Underground Railroad as a young man before eventually making Tennessee his home. A graduate of West Point and a veteran of both the Seminole and Mexican Wars, he ultimately cast his lot with the South and now found himself defending one of the Confederacy's most important river fortifications against the United States Army. Johnson's tenure as commander, however, would be very short. On February 9th, Johnston ordered Brigadier General Gideon Pillow to Fort Donelson. He arrived only hours after Johnson had assumed command, and because Pillow's commission predated Johnston's, he in turn assumed command of the post. Like Grant and so many other senior officers on both sides, Pillow was a veteran of the Mexican War, although not with the professional military training that many of them had. Few questioned Pillow's willingness to expose himself to enemy fire. Many, however, questioned his judgment and, to some degree, his integrity. During and after the Mexican War, Pillow had become embroiled in bitter disputes over credit for victories, particularly with General Winfield Scott, and those controversies followed him into civilian life and eventually into the Civil War itself. Pillow assured Johnston that Fort Donelson could be held, and Johnston accepted that judgment. Soon afterward came yet another change. Brigadier General John B. Floyd, the former U.S. Secretary of War, arrived with additional Confederate troops. Again, as Floyd's commission as Brigadier General predated Pillow's, making him the senior officer present, command of the fort passed to him. Floyd's background also differed considerably from that of Bushrod Johnson. Whereas Johnson had spent much of his adult life as a professional soldier, Floyd's career, like Pillow, had been shaped largely by politics. His service as Secretary of War under President James Buchanan had made him one of the South's best-known political figures, but it had also made him deeply controversial in the North, where many believed he'd improperly transferred arms and military supplies into Southern arsenals before the secession. Whether those accusations were entirely fair or not, Floyd understood that capture by federal forces might carry consequences extending far beyond ordinary imprisonment as a prisoner of war. And then, as Confederate reinforcements continued arriving, Brigadier General Simon Buckner also reached Fort Donelson with his division. Buckner, like Bushrod Johnson, was a professionally trained soldier and veteran of the old United States Army. His military experience and temperament often contrasted sharply with those of Gideon Pillow. The two men had known one another for years, and their relationship had been strained ever since disagreements that stretched back to the Mexican War and continued afterward in the Nashville newspapers. And Buckner's date of rank was later than Floyd and Pillow, but earlier than Johnson. So at this point, Johnson's position at the fort moved to fourth in command after having briefly been the commander of the post just a few days before. And so in the span of only a few days, command of Fort Donelson had passed from Tillman to Bushrod Johnson to Gideon Pillow, and finally to John B. Floyd. On paper, the chain of command was perfectly clear. In practice, however, Fort Donelson now contained 4 brigadier generals with vastly different backgrounds, personalities, and approaches to command. 2 had spent much of their adult lives in politics. 2 had been professional soldiers. And some carried old disagreements that had never been settled. Whether by necessity or circumstances, Albert Sidney Johnston had assembled a rather questionable command structure at Fort Donelson that was about to face one of the greatest early tests of the Civil War. When Grant's leading troops arrived outside Fort Donelson on February 12, 1862, they found a very different situation from the one they'd encountered at Fort Henry. Although both forts had been constructed to guard important rivers, Fort Donelson occupied much stronger ground. Rather than sitting on a floodplain, it stood on bluffs overlooking the Cumberland River. The Confederate engineers had taken full advantage of the terrain. Heavy artillery dominated the river approach, while an extensive line of earthworks and rifle pits stretched across the landward side of the fort, protecting the roads leading into Dover and beyond toward Nashville. If Fort Henry had demonstrated the weakness of poor terrain, Fort Donelson would soon demonstrate the strength of good terrain. Grant understood almost immediately that this would not be another short battle. Over the next 2 days, Union troops gradually spread themselves around the Confederate position. Grant's immediate objective was to extend his lines around the fort as quickly as possible, tightening the noose before the Confederates could significantly strengthen their position or withdraw from it, and then wait for Flag Officer Foote's gunboats to arrive before undertaking major operations. There were constant skirmishes as both sides probed one another's lines, but neither army committed itself to a general engagement. Meanwhile, inside Fort Donelson, the Confederates used every available hour to strengthen their position. Despite Grant's efforts, Confederate reinforcements continued arriving over the next couple of days, and the Union Army encirclement remained incomplete. Earthworks were improved, and artillery was repositioned. The brief delay caused by weather, flooded roads, and the movement of reinforcements had benefited both sides, but perhaps no one appreciated that reality more than the Confederates. Every hour brought them another opportunity to prepare for the attack that they knew was coming. By February 13th, the encirclement of the fort was nearly complete. Grant's army now occupied much of the high ground surrounding the Confederate positions. Escape routes were becoming increasingly limited, though they were by no means completely closed off. The stage had been set for the next phase of the campaign. Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote arrived with his flotilla during the evening and early morning hours, bringing with him the same confidence that had carried the Union Navy to victory only a week earlier at Fort Henry. And to be perfectly fair to Admiral Foote, there was every reason for that confidence. Only 8 days earlier, his ironclads had largely reduced Fort Henry before Grant's infantry could even completely surround the fort. The gunboats had proven themselves to be powerful weapons, and there was every reason to believe that they might accomplish the very same thing again. But there was one crucial difference. Fort Henry had been fought from low ground and from fortifications that were partly unusable due to flooding. Fort Donelson would fight from higher ground. That difference would prove to be significant. If you enjoy the stories we tell each week and would like to show your support, I'd like to invite you to check out the Summers Media Enterprises merchandise store. You'll find shirts, hats, mugs, stickers, and other items featuring both the Tennessee History Nerd and Dauphin Island Diaries. This month's featured item is one of my personal favorites, our I Break for Historical Markers bumper stickers. Whether you're the kind of person who can't drive past a historical marker without pulling over, or you simply appreciate a good piece of history, it's a fun way to let everyone know you're always on the lookout for the next great story. To browse the entire collection, just visit the link in the show notes or visit the Summers Media Enterprises website. Every purchase helps to support the work that goes into researching, producing, and sharing these stories each week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting our podcasts. And now let's get back into the story. On February 14th, 1862, Valentine's Day, Foote ordered his gunboats forward, and the Confederates stood by and waited for them to come in range. Foote had arranged his ironclads in line, intending to bring the full weight of their heavy guns against the river defenses while presenting the smallest possible target to the Confederate artillery. It was a plan that had worked remarkably well only 8 days earlier at Fort Henry, and there was every reason to believe it might work again. The Confederate gunners, however, remained remarkably disciplined. When the Federal vessels entered effective range, Confederate batteries erupted into action. The opening exchange quickly demonstrated that Fort Donelson was not Fort Henry. At Fort Henry, Foote's gunboats had enjoyed many of the advantages. The fort's low position, its flooded interior, and the gradual loss of several Confederate guns had all worked in the Union's favor. Here, almost every one of those advantages belonged to the defenders instead. The Confederate artillery fired from elevated, well-prepared positions overlooking the river approach. The batteries stood above the river, though not on towering bluffs. Their advantage was less about dramatic elevation and more about placement. They were fixed, protected, and had a well-defined killing ground. And every foot the gunboats advanced brought them deeper into increasingly accurate Confederate fire. For a time, the two sides exchanged heavy fire at surprisingly close range, but the Confederate batteries refused to yield. The Confederate fire was so accurate that one gunner deliberately shot the smokestack off of a Union gunboat. Instead of gradually silencing the Southern guns as they had done at Fort Henry, the Union vessels themselves began suffering serious damage. Armor was battered. Pilot houses were struck. Steering gear failed. Admiral Foote himself was wounded during the engagement as fragments entered the pilot house of his flagship. It had become painfully obvious that what had worked at Fort Henry wasn't going to work at Fort Donelson. Recognizing that continuing the attack would accomplish little beyond sacrificing ships and sailors, Foote reluctantly ordered the flotilla to withdraw downstream. Two of the gunboats were already adrift and floating back downstream, having lost power due to the Confederate barrage. For the Confederates, it was an important victory. Their confidence soared. The Union Navy, which had seemed almost unstoppable only days before, had been turned back. Inside Fort Donelson, some now believed that the fort could withstand whatever Grant and Foote might throw against it. Outside the fort, Grant reached a different conclusion. If Fort Donelson was going to fall, the Army was going to have to take it. The morning of February 15th dawned bitterly cold. Snow had fallen during the night, adding yet another layer of misery to the men who had already spent days exposed to freezing temperature with little shelter. Thousands of soldiers on both sides rose before daylight, stiff from sleeping on frozen ground and uncertain what the new day would bring. Inside Fort Donelson, however, the Confederate commanders had already made their decision. Every hour that passed tightened Grant's grip around the fort. Although the Federal lines had not yet completely sealed every avenue of escape, Floyd, Pillow, Buckner, and Johnson understood that the time was no longer working in their favor. Johnston had entrusted them with holding Fort Donelson as long as practical, buying precious time for the Confederacy to strengthen the defenses of Nashville. They had accomplished that objective. The question now was whether remaining inside the fort accomplished anything more. The answer they reached was no. Rather than waiting for Grant to complete his encirclement and settle into a formal siege, the Confederate commanders decided to attack. Their immediate objective wasn't to destroy Grant's army, though no commander would object to such an opportunity. Their goal was much simpler and far more practical: They intended to drive the Union forces away from Wynn's Ferry Road, the principal route leading south toward Nashville. If they could reopen that road, even briefly, the Army could march out of Fort Donelson and continue to fight another day. From a military standpoint, it was a sound plan. An army trapped inside fixed fortifications surrenders the initiative to its opponent. By attacking first, the Confederates hoped to seize that initiative back. More importantly, they hoped to preserve nearly 15,000 soldiers for future campaigns. The Confederacy could replace forts. Replacing trained soldiers was far more difficult. Shortly before dawn, Confederate troops moved quietly into position. When the attack began, it struck the Union right flank under Brigadier General John A. McClernand. The fighting became fierce. Confederate brigades pressed forward with determination, gradually forcing portions of the Federal line backward. What began as a stubborn resistance soon became a fighting withdrawal as Federal units yielded ground to the weight of the Confederate assault. The attack was working. For perhaps the first time since the fall of Fort Henry, the Confederates had wrested the initiative away from Grant. As the morning wore on, Wynn's Ferry Road, the very road that they had come to reopen, gradually fell back into Confederate hands. For the first time in days, escape appeared not only possible, but increasingly likely. Outside the Confederate lines, however, one man was conspicuously absent. Ulysses Grant wasn't on the battlefield. Grant had gone down to the river to confer with Flag Officer Andrew Foote following the failed naval attack the previous afternoon. Since no major offensive action was expected that morning, he'd left the immediate supervision of the Army to his division commanders. That decision would later draw criticism from some quarters, but it's worth remembering that Grant had every reason to believe that the Confederates would remain behind their fortifications after successfully repulsing Foote's gunboats only hours earlier. Instead, they did exactly the opposite. By the time reports reached Grant that heavy fighting was underway on the Union right, the Confederate attack had already achieved significant success. By late morning, Wynn's Ferry Road had been reopened. The escape route the Confederate commanders had set out to secure now lay open before them. Had the Army immediately marched out, a substantial portion of the Confederate force might well have escaped before Grant could react. Instead, events took an unexpected turn. The success of the attack convinced Gideon Pillow that the Confederates had accomplished more than simply opening an escape route. He believed that they had driven the Union Army from the field. Confident that the immediate danger had passed, Pillow sent word to Floyd describing the morning's attack as a victory. That confidence changed the plan. Rather than ordering the Army to begin marching immediately down Wynn's Ferry Road, Pillow instructed many of the attacking troops to return toward the Confederate works. His men had been fighting for hours. Ammunition had been heavily expended. Units had become intermixed, and many soldiers had left their knapsacks inside their trenches. Pillow believed that there was time to reorganize the command, replenish ammunition, retrieve their equipment, and then conduct a more orderly withdrawal. It's one of the most pivotal decisions of the entire campaign. With more than 160 years of hindsight, it's easy to criticize Pillow's decision, but at the moment he made it, he believed that the Confederates had regained control of the battlefield. From his perspective, taking time to restore order before beginning a retreat probably seemed prudent rather than reckless. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, wars often punish hesitation. Every minute spent reorganizing was another minute for Grant to return, assess the situation, and respond. The escape route remained open, but the opportunity to use it was growing smaller by the minute. Grant was several miles away, confirmed with Flag Officer Foote when the Confederate attack began, but couriers soon reached him with reports that heavy fighting was underway and that portions of the Union right had been driven back. Grant immediately mounted his horse and rode toward the battlefield. As he approached the front, many officers expected him to react by rushing reinforcements to the battered right flank. Instead, Grant noticed something that the others had overlooked. the Confederates had attacked with nearly their entire strength. To Grant, that revealed something just as important as the ground that had been lost. If the Confederates had stripped men from their trenches to launch such a powerful attack, then somewhere else along the line, those defenses had necessarily been weakened. Rather than dwelling on what had gone wrong, Grant immediately focused on the opportunity the Confederate attack had created. Grant immediately ordered a counterattack. While McClernand's men stabilized the Union right, Brigadier General Charles Ferguson Smith was ordered to attack the weakened Confederate left, and Lew Wallace renewed the pressure in the center. Confederate troops, many of whom had begun falling back toward their original positions after Pillow's order to withdraw, suddenly found themselves defending against a fresh Federal assault before they'd fully reorganized. What had begun as one of the Confederacy's greatest opportunities of the campaign now rapidly slipped away. By the close of the day, much of the ground gained during the morning had been lost again. More importantly, the escape route the Confederates had fought so hard to reopen was once again effectively closed. As darkness settled over Fort Donelson on February 15th, the Confederate commanders faced a grim reality. Their best opportunity to save the army had come, and it had been frittered away by a bad decision. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on the Tennessee History Nerd, there's another show you might want to check out, Dauphin Island Diaries. Same approach, different setting. Stories from the Gulf Coast, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, back to our story. That evening, the senior Confederate commanders gathered to consider their remaining options. The optimism that existed only hours before had vanished. Wynn's Ferry Road had been reopened. The opportunity to escape had been real, but now the Union Army once again stood between Fort Donelson and Nashville. The question before the commanders was painfully simple. What now? The discussion quickly revealed that the four generals did not see their situation in the same way. And Nathan Bedford Forrest, who commanded the Confederate cavalry, dismissed the very idea of surrender. He reportedly declared that he hadn't come to Fort Donelson to surrender his command, and he had no intention of doing so now. If the infantry intended to remain, that was their decision. Forrest intended to attempt escape. General John B. Floyd faced a different dilemma. As the former United States Secretary of War, he believed capture by federal forces might lead to something far more serious than ordinary imprisonment as a prisoner of war. Whether those fears were fully justified has been debated ever since, but Floyd had no intention of testing the question. Gideon Pillow reached much the same conclusion. Whatever the outcome, neither he nor Floyd wished to become Union prisoners. Simon Bolivar, however, saw the situation differently. The opportunity to escape had been lost. The army was surrounded once again. Continuing the fight would almost certainly result in needless bloodshed without changing the outcome. Buckner believed the time had come to acknowledge reality. Floyd, as the senior officer present, still possessed the authority to make the final decision. Instead, during the night, he chose to transfer command to Pillow. Pillow wanted no part of surrendering the army either. He promptly passed command to Buckner. It remains one of the most remarkable sequences of command transfers in American military history. In the span of only a few hours, two senior generals declined the responsibility that accompanied the command, leaving Buckner to accept the burden neither them wanted nor was willing to accept the responsibility for. Buckner didn't inherit an army he could save. He inherited one he would have to surrender. Before the surrender became official, each of the principal Confederate commanders carried out the decision he'd made the night before. Nathan Bedford Forrest led his cavalry and several hundred mounted infantry through flooded bottomland across Lick Creek and escaped to continue the war. John B. Floyd, unwilling to risk capture, departed by steamboat with portions of his Virginia brigade. Gideon Pillow accompanied Floyd, having first passed the burden of surrender to Buckner. Bushrod Johnson initially remained behind, avoiding attention during the surrender proceedings, but several days later quietly slipped away into the surrounding woods and escaped as well. In the end, only Simon Buckner remained to accept responsibility for the army that had been entrusted to his command. Before daylight on February 16th, Buckner sent a note under a flag of truce to General Grant. In it, he proposed the appointment of commissioners to agree upon terms for the surrender of Fort Donelson. It was a customary military request, one that officers had made for generations when a position had become untenable. Grant's reply became one of the most famous letters of the Civil War. He declined Buckner's request for negotiations and instead wrote, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The response stunned Buckner. The two men had known one another for years. They had served together during the Mexican War, and during difficult financial times before the Civil War, Buckner had loaned Grant money when Grant found himself in desperate circumstances after leaving the Army. They were more than comrades, they were friends. If Buckner hoped that friendship might soften Grant's position, he was mistaken. Grant understood that friendship and duty were two different things. As commander of the Union Army before Fort Donelson, his responsibility was not to negotiate favorable terms for an army that had already exhausted its opportunities to escape. His responsibility was to end the campaign as quickly as possible and to preserve the lives of his own soldiers by avoiding another unnecessary assault if surrender could be secured immediately. Buckner, for his part, understood the position in which Grant found himself. Although he reportedly described the terms as ungenerous and unchivalrous, he also recognized that further resistance would accomplish nothing except additional bloodshed. A short time later, Fort Donelson officially surrendered. Nearly 15,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms, making it the largest surrender of an American army up to that point in the nation's history. It was a stunning Union victory and one that sent shockwaves throughout both the North and the South. For Ulysses S. Grant, it marked the moment that he became a national figure. Newspapers across the North quickly seized upon his demand for unconditional surrender, and before long, people were saying that the initials U.S. no longer stood for merely Ulysses Simpson Grant. They stood for Unconditional Surrender Grant. Once Buckner accepted the terms, something rather remarkable happened. The stern commander who had insisted upon unconditional surrender was no longer dealing with an enemy commander resisting his army. The surrender was complete, and Grant's role immediately changed. The two former comrades met again, not as negotiators seeking advantage, but as old friends whose nations had placed them on opposite sides of the war. Grant treated Buckner with courtesy and respect. Recognizing the difficult position in which his old friend found himself, he offered financial assistance if Buckner should need it while in federal captivity. Buckner declined the offer, but he never forgot the gesture. Grant also demonstrated concern for the welfare of the surrendered Confederate soldiers. Victory had been secured. There was no advantage to be gained by humiliating defeated men or making their situation unnecessarily difficult. Military duty required firmness. Humanity now required something different. It's that contrast, perhaps, more than anything else, that makes Fort Donelson such a compelling story. Grant showed that it was possible to wage war with determination without allowing war to extinguish personal honor or compassion. Buckner, in turn, accepted responsibility for an army he could no longer save, choosing surrender over the needless sacrifice of the men still under his command. After the war, each of the two friends went on to political careers. Grant, of course, became President of the United States. Buckner went on to serve as the governor of the state of Kentucky. Shortly before Grant's death, Buckner visited Grant. Grant was dying, and he knew it, and so did Buckner. Grant accepted Buckner's visit in spite of his poor physical condition at that point. When Grant passed away just a few days later, Buckner served as one of Grant's pallbearers. The two friends, adversaries in arms during the nation's greatest crisis, nevertheless retained their friendship in spite of those differences. Buckner showed his love for his old friend in that final tribute, the last surrender of all. And I have to believe that had the roles been reversed, Grant would have done the same for Buckner. And that's going to do it for this week's episode, A Surrender Between Friends. I hope you'll join us next week when we resume our drive across Tennessee, and this time we'll be headed into Bledsoe County. Join us next week for episode 19, Driving Across Tennessee, Bledsoe County edition. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, the Tennessee History Nerd, and I am history. As is now my habit, I wanted to take a moment before completely finishing up today to talk about the resources I used to create this episode. I drew from a number of excellent works on the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson campaign. My principal references included James R. Knight's The Battle of Fort Donelson, No Terms but Unconditional Surrender, Kendall D. Gott's Where the South Lost the War, Hank Koopman's Decisions at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, Benjamin Franklin Cooling's The Campaign for Fort Donelson, Edwin C. Bierce' The Fall of Fort Henry, and Unconditional Surrender, The Fall of Fort Donelson, Darrell R. Smith's The War Department Tablets of Fort Donelson National Battlefield, the interpretive materials of Fort Donelson National Battlefield, and Roy Morris Jr.'s excellent article on Bushrod Johnson published by Warfare History Network. As always, I compared information across multiple sources whenever possible, particularly where historians differ in their interpretations or where first-hand accounts conflict. I want to thank all the authors, historians, archivists, museum curators, and researchers upon whose work I rely to create these episodes. Without them, I can't do what I do. I owe them a huge debt of gratitude. And one final note. The Fort Donelson campaign is rich enough to fill several episodes by itself. I intentionally didn't try to cover every tactical movement, every brigade action, or every decision made over those 5 days. Instead, my purpose was different. This episode focuses on the men who led the campaign and what the battle revealed about their character, judgment, and leadership. The military operations provide the setting, but the story I wanted to tell was ultimately about the decisions those commanders made and the consequences that followed. Thanks for listening. Hey, this is Big John Summers, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the Tennessee History Nerd. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to know that there's a lot more content waiting for you out there. We're adding new episodes every week, and we're working our way across the whole state of Tennessee, covering stories from prehistory all the way into the 20th century. So if you like Tennessee history, there's already a catalog of stories out there for you to explore. So scroll back through those previous episodes. You might just find something you weren't expecting. And again, thanks so much for listening.